I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on the Spotlight Network, we're diving into the rugged world of Tusk, an Alaskan adventure in gold, ivory, and folklore. It's written by a terrific author. His name is Stephen Pidgeon. This gripping novel weaves a tale of family tragedy, treasure hunting, and survival in the untamed wilderness of Alaska. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Atticus Publishing for helping us put him in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support authors like him by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing his amazing book. The links are below this interview. Stephen, great to see you here today on Spotlight. Thank you for joining me.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, Logan, and thank you for asking me to join your program.
It's my pleasure. This is an amazing book. It's like a trip to Alaska without having to buy a plane ticket, which is great, and travel all those hours. Before we get into your book, let me ask you a little bit about what brought you to Alaska. Were you born there? Did you migrate there? Tell us a little bit about your own Alaskan adventure.
Well, Logan, I was actually born in California, Northern California, up in
Mhm.
Mendocino County. And, I just kind of lived a life of a Northern California boy enjoying the heat in the summer.
Yeah.
I had never seen snow before, but my parents felt very trapped. And after Alaska became a state in 1959, they decided that they wanted to raise their children in the adventurous last frontier. And so in February of 1963, we left for Alaska. And I had never seen snow before. So the first time I saw snow, I went and woke my parents up. I said, "You got to come out here. What is it?" I said, "I don't know. There's somebody on the roof throwing white stuff all over the backyard. You need to see it." you know. And my dad,
Great.
he came out and looked at it and said, "It's just snowing.
Yeah.
But we arrived in Alaska in February of '63, and I was at the time I was 8 years old, and so really my life was really shaped by Alaska from that point forward. And we have a saying up here, Logan, that Alaska doesn't grow on you. It makes you perfectly unacceptable to live anywhere else. You know? And
I
that,
can I can see that its natural beauty seems like it's unmatched. I think the instincts and the skills you need to survive in such a climate mold the person that you are. You moving there at 8 years old, you basically had no choice. It's not like you were 18. You said, Mom and Dad, I'm not going. I don't want to leave high school. So you went without a choice and you learned to love it though, right?
yeah, I really did. And it becomes part of your heart and soul. Once you learn to adjust. I mean, the first year I went to school there, I was walking to school in 45 below weather. And
Wow.
the second year I was there, I was walking in 55 below. And my fifth grade teacher came to me and she said, Stephen, you're walking to school. You need to be very careful. I said, why is that? She said, well, there's wild dogs and the wild dogs will take you if you're not on top of this. And I only had to walk 5 blocks to school, but it was very much a concern because in Alaska, the climate is so dramatic. It will take your life just like that. If you don't know what you're doing and you're not always applying the rules of survival, you won't survive. And so this was the case. And in fact, I lost many, many friends. I went to 18 funerals before I was 21 years old. And these were all close friends who had died in one way or another in a very, very difficult environment. So,
Generally from exposure that people freeze to death.
no, it would be things like motorcycle wrecks, snow machine accidents, car accidents, sliding off slippery roads, icy roads, going into cliffs, rolling a car in treacherous conditions, being caught in a place they shouldn't have been caught. One person died running. He was out jogging on a mountain trail and he slipped. And that was all it took. He fell 200 feet. And another friend died in a hang gliding accident, got caught in a downdraft and away he went. And of course, the last funeral was the funeral of my sister, who died in a head-on collision. And since then, there have been many, many, we see these tragedies around us all the time. Yesterday, I was looking at the picture of a moose that last year had frozen to death in 40 below zero, and some people found him and propped him up and had him standing up there. But the truth is that you really have to know what you're doing. And this is what Tusk is all about. Because I was inspired to write the book, Logan, because, to tell people I could come to California and describe to you, well, it's pretty rough in Anchorage. Well, It's pretty difficult. It's pretty trying. But unless you actually go through the experiences, you don't know how trying it is. And so for many of us who live up here, we know that the difficulties can be tremendous. And so trying to stay on top of that at all times is how you stay alive.
Exactly. You got to have provisions on hand, I'd imagine. Backup generator if possible. You have to be always prepared for the worst. You
Yes,
basically always brace for the storm in a way, right?
that's right. And we have storms here that go unclocked. We had a storm 2 years ago where the winds were above 150 miles an hour for more than a week.
Wow.
And it didn't even make the news in Anchorage. It's like, well, whatever. They had a little bit of wind out there in the valley.
Amazing, amazing. And those are hurricane force winds, but it's ice cold, which
Yeah.
is amazing. Yeah, it really is a different lifestyle. So your life experience brought you to Tusk. Basically, you borrowed from here and there, stories you heard, stories you experienced, a little bit of your own life. Tell us, give us an overview of Tusk.
Well, Tusk is a very fascinating story. I mean, I started writing the book, I wrote the middle of the book and it sat for years. And finally I said, well, look, this has to have a little bit more preliminary understanding. I've got to set the foundation for who these people are. And this is when the concept of elegy came to mind. And elegy, I wasn't really planning on this, but it was an inspiration that came to me. And elegy is just this tremendous tragic life. This young girl who leaves a horrible home in the South, comes to Nevada to work. She marries a guy at the restaurant where she's waitressing. He's an abuser, and he takes her to Alaska on a whim. And she ends up having three children by three different men. The first child is from her husband. The second child is from her husband's boss, who rapes her on the ship passage to Alaska. And the third child is from this gold miner named Coyote. And Coyote is a very rugged Alaskan individual. He has the genesis in a character up here that was known as Colonel Girdwood, mining at the Bird Creek mine. And so this takes place at Bird Creek and also at the Hope mine. And the kind of idea that you see is these reckless kind of gold miners, prospectors going after this thing with a gold lust, and they get some and they lose some, and they get some and they lose some, and so it is. And so it is this kind of a quest for life that is sometimes realized and then it slips through the fingers. And this is what we see. And with Ella G, she becomes the mother of three children. And these three children now are going to develop these three different prongs of life in Alaska, disparate from one another. And they don't come together until really the memorial of her death.
Very, very fascinating. So you basically took this woman and her three children from three different men, and built three different storylines in your book that you weave together and they converge only at the death of Ella, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And her death it's very interesting because in Alaskan history, at least in my life, there were some very significant events. The most poignant event, of course, was the Great Alaskan Earthquake of 1964, which I had the opportunity to experience having moved up here in 63. This earthquake was a 9.2 earthquake,
Oh,
and it lasted for 5.5 minutes and, destroyed virtually all the trappings of civilization in Anchorage. And so this was a very large marker. But interestingly enough, 25 years later, to the day, practically to the hour, the Exxon Valdez went on the rocks in Prince William Sound, spilling 11 million gallons of crude oil all over the Prince William Sound.
wow.
And so the question is, what caused these events and how did these events interweave into this life of these three children?
Tell
And
us a
it's
little bit more about the three. Maybe you want to start with one of them and tell us his or her journey.
Yeah, sure. Well, one of them, of course, is the daughter whose name is Betha. And Betha she is the daughter of the rape, and she's very much a wicked persona, if you will.
Mhm.
Is very reckless and she's very rebellious. And as a child, she gets involved with a young fellow who's ends up shooting his whole family. Now, by the way, Logan, this experience of this young fellow shooting his whole family is a true story.
Right.
It's not the names of the people that happened, but it was actually a house where we lived, where the young man had killed his whole family and the two next door neighbors. She meets him and she ends up inheriting his firearm. She ends up going to a juvenile facility. And at that juvenile facility, she's very brilliant. She's a very smart girl. And she becomes kind of a jailhouse lawyer, if you will, while she's in the juvenile facility. And when she finally is released, and they held her until the very last minute, until the end of her 18th year, released her on her 19th birthday, she's hitchhiking out of Anchorage and she is picked up by another young woman who's come from New Hampshire to practice law in Alaska. And she recommends to her, well, why don't we go climb the Butte? It's a very famous landmark out here in the valley. It's a hill it's about 1,000 feet high, and it's commonly climbed in the summer. Beautiful spot. So they decide to go climb the Butte. Well, as they're walking up, they stumble on bear scat. And when they see the bear scat, they recognize, gee, there might be a bear. And sure enough, there is one. But the girl from New Hampshire is an athlete, and she can outrun Betha. But as fate would have it, Betha falls off a ledge, drops 20 feet, and the bear can't get to her. And the bear takes the other girl instead. So she finds the other girl's wallet and decides to assume her identity. And she climbs back down the hill, sits in her car, and spends 2 hours signing her name until she can sign her name perfectly, drives to Fairbanks, and becomes a lawyer in Alaska, just like that.
Oh, wow. Very, very cool premise, very cool setup, very cool storyline, very interesting character. Have you envisioned this as a film at all? It sounds like between the Alaskan wilderness and these compelling characters, it's a natural fit.
Oh, it would be a fantastic. I mean, there's so much action, if you will.
Yeah,
And again, all this action is, of course, things that actually happen.
right.
But of course, there's a huge climax in the beginning part of the book, which takes place during the earthquake. But following the earthquake, we have the center of the book, which is the Tusk. And what takes place is Ernie, the gold miner, who makes his living smuggling gold and illegal ivory. You know, it's illegal for a person to own ivory if you're not an Alaskan native. You can't
Mm.
own uncut ivory. But he's smuggling uncut ivory. And at one point, his friend, who's a helicopter pilot, is flying along doing search and rescue, and he looks down and he spots this lake that is full of woolly mammoth tusks.
Oh,
Which, by the way, this is a true story, by the way. And so he says, he goes back and he tells Ernie, he says, hey, I found this thing. Well, they go out and look, and sure enough, Ernie's able to pull out a couple of tusks. Well, these tusks are worth a fortune, and this lake is full of them. So they're going to harvest all these tusks, and they're going to smuggle them out of the country. And he's actually going to trade them for guns with Russians in the Bering Sea. And so in the meantime, all of these things that go on in this story are just so commonplace in Alaska. They're very typical stories that happen of whether it's a bear attack or at one point, there's one other true aspect in the story. Logan, I got to tell you this part. This is true. They come into this gold miner's house in Fairbanks after he's shot, and they're trying to rescue the girl who was with him. And as they're stumbling around his house, they find a little 2 foot wide door going down to a basement that he has dug out of his own crawl space. So they go down this narrow staircase and they reach up to grab the string that holds the light bulb, and they turn the light bulb on. And what do they discover? Two 55-gallon oil drums full to the brim with gold nuggets.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing. These are truly Alaskan stories. I mean, nowhere in New York City is somebody finding drums of oil filled with gold or woolly mammoth tusks, buried, it could only happen in Alaska kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, it really does have the trappings of a movie. I mean, whether you're talking, and particularly if somebody wanted to film it in Alaska,
Yeah.
because of course, the magnificence of the beauty up here and all of the various settings that take place, whether you're flying the PBY-12 out to some lost lake in the middle of the third world,
Yep.
whether you're finding the Yellow Dog Mine, whether you're hanging out in Fairbanks, whether you're on the boat to Kodiak, whatever the situation may be, all of that is contained in the book and it makes for very dramatic events.
Absolutely. Talk to us a little bit about the rivalry between Mackenzie and Coyote.
Oh, yeah. Well, again, Mackenzie is modeled after a real figure. I will tell you that. And Coyote is, of course, the gold miner. Mackenzie's a claim jumper. And of
Mm,
course, the Mackenzie name is known in Alaska for claim jumping during the time of when Nome was in its heyday in the 1890s. And so Mackenzie is this claim jumper. And he's also a funeral home director and he has a casket making business. And so he's the one making caskets down in Seward. And this rivalry is very straightforward. Mackenzie wants to steal the gold of Coyote. That's what he wants to do. And so he sets up a strike on the gold mine with three snipers to
mm,
kill the gold miners and steal their gold. Unfortunate for him, and this is also the way it is in Alaska, everybody else is armed too.
mm,
And they find the cache of the snipers, and he finds the cache because they were smoking cigarettes. And he caught the smoke and he was able to find their lair and he set them up. And so they managed to capture all three. And so the rivalry continues. And the idea of Ernie coming downtown to burn down Mackenzie's house as a result of Mackenzie trying to sniper fire him,
oh,
this turns into quite the row. And ultimately, the ultimate scene between Mackenzie and Ernie and Coyote is when they're on the barge coming out of Anchorage. They're on a
mm,
barge. The barge is set loose into the water. And Mackenzie manages to get off that barge onto a dory that's tied on the barge. And the barge ends up at sea, no anchor, no motor, in the middle of the Cook Inlet in 20-foot seas.
wow.
And this description that takes place for Coyote on that barge is actually something that actually happened to my father in Cook Inlet. Those very circumstances happened. And but nonetheless, Coyote is able to succeed. And ultimately, Mackenzie, who is a persona, he's kind of married between a number of personas up here. Yes, he was Mackenzie the gold miner, but he was also a guy who murdered his own wife.
Mm,
He was also a guy who was a serial rapist. So he's kind of married. There was a guy up here who was a serial rapist named Zigger was his name. And he ultimately was found in a shallow grave, the Zigger fellow.
mm,
But Mackenzie commits the crimes that Zigger committed. And finally, one of the girls that he had left for dead at McHugh's Creek, which, by the way, is another magnificently beautiful setting on
mm.
Turnagain Arm, the base of a mountain where bears and tall sheep can be found. This is where he leaves her for dead. She survives, and he doesn't know who she is. But she is the one who eventually takes him down outside the courthouse in Anchorage. And that's where he dies.
Amazing. The more you talk about the book, the more I think it should actually be a series rather than a film because there's so many stories there. I mean, I could see this as like an 8-part series on Amazon Prime or Netflix or something, each one about an hour and change each because you got a lot to unpack. And I think keeping the story intact, particularly with the three main characters that intertwine, is essential. Tell us a little bit about RT and RT's path.
Yeah, RT has the most interesting path of the three of them. I think RT is an absolutely wonderful person, and he has a little bit more standards than the than the other secularist in the book, if you will. But RT he's Coyote's son. And Coyote gets together with Ella G and he buys her a car and she's working for him. And on March 27th in the evening, she leaves the office and she's going to Penny's to get some makeup. And she gets some makeup and she comes back out into her brand new car and she puts the baby down on the floor between the front seat and under the dashboard. And she gets in the car and the quake breaks out.
Mm.
And the most notorious pictures of Anchorage during the quake in 64 was the face of Penny's falling off the building and crushing a car to the ground where a woman was trapped in the car and died. And in this case, it was Ella G. And before anybody can get there, Coyote actually goes and retrieves his son from the car. And so RT grows up with Coyote's later wife, not knowing his brother and sister at all. He grows up in a completely different household and he grows up in a completely different way. And his quest is to become a politician in Alaska. And so he works among the kind of the dirty circles of politics, if you will, in Anchorage, including taking money from the son of none other than Mackenzie for his campaign.
Yeah. Amazing, amazing. Also a fascinating storyline. I also like how you borrowed the imagery of the penny sign falling and crushing a car and incorporated that into your story because the more real life events that you incorporate into your story, the more real that the story feels and is for the reader, don't you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like there's a scene, if you're ever up here, if you decide, well, I want to come to Alaska and visit some of these sites that take place.
Yep.
It's an event that takes place when Mackenzie, with his guys, they're going to hope to launch another assault on Coyote's gold mine on the Resurrection Creek. And in order to get down there on the old highway, they had to go through what's called Canyon Creek, which was a road that went down like this and crossed the only curved bridge in Alaska and then came back up. Well, in the 64 quake, that bridge did in fact collapse. And the people on that bridge did in fact fall to the bottom of that creek. And I knew the fellow who went down there to rescue the people that had fallen into that creek. So, and by the way, that bridge was rebuilt and it's not used anymore, but it's still standing. And a person can see that very bridge where Mackenzie was the only one to survive. He got out of the international travel law before it collapsed with the bridge, but his henchmen did not. The bridge collapsed. He was cut off from being able to return to Anchorage and was forced to walk all the way to the 50-mile house, which, by the way, is a landmark that is also still standing.
Very cool. Very cool. Do you feel that Alaska in some ways aside from its natural beauty, can be a little bit of a dark place because of all the natural disasters that befall people there. And, perhaps even get some aberrant behavior from time to time because of the extremes.
Uh,
What do you think? That's just my observation from hearing your stories.
No, Logan, you are exactly right on it. You know, there's a saying inside the book, and it's a saying that goes around up here, but it's a saying that's in the last chapter of the book. Anchorage, you come there for the scenery, you stay because you got murdered. You know,
That's so funny. That's great. Baltimore has a similar slogan. It says Baltimore more than just murder. So that's
yeah,
funny. But I
yeah.
like that. Alaska, Anchorage, come for the scenery and you don't leave because you're murdered. Crazy, crazy.
And so
Um,
there is a dangerousness to it. Yes, there is.
yeah, it's kind of like the Wild West or the Last Frontier. I mean, from what you describe in a way, because you're dealing with uncontrollable natural elements. Almost everybody is a newcomer or some kind of migrant to the area, a very few locally born people. So it's a little transitory in nature. So it makes for an interesting mix of characters, I'm sure. And a lot of people probably escape to Alaska for a different, a better life, right?
Yeah, there's many reasons to come to Alaska. Some come to escape,
Right.
some come for the wilderness, some come for the freedom, some come for the beauty. And
Yeah.
it's a testing ground. You know, you either love it or you hate it. But many people who do come here love it. I mean, I love the place. I love the struggle of the place. There is a struggle to live here, and that struggle defines the character of the person. And I love that aspect of it, you
Yeah.
know. And there is, and there are many beautiful things up here too. I mean, I don't want anybody to get the wrong impression.
Sure. Sure.
But when you deal with the time of Tusk, yeah, it was the Wild West. It
Yeah.
was the Wild West in its most wild form.
Right. What era, what decade is Tusk set in?
Well, Tusk is set from 1957 until 1989.
Hmm.
And so a lot of the encompassing years, when you go from 57 until about 72, there was very little law in Alaska. I mean, almost
Right.
none. When I grew up here, we had one policeman for 150 square miles, and he went to
Wow.
bed at night, you know. So you're pretty much on your own. And the
Yeah.
motif was do whatever you want, we'll pick up your body. Because, Alaska had its own sheriff, and it's called the weather, right?
Right.
And
Amazing.
But then in 72, the pipeline came in, and the pipeline brought in an anarchy that was unbelievable. It was just unbelievable. That continued until really 82. There's still residual anarchy from the pipeline in Alaska. A lot of it settled down. But now Anchorage is a very multicultural city. There's 65 languages spoken in the
Mm.
Anchorage School District, to give you an idea.
Amazing, amazing. I haven't been to Alaska. It's definitely on the bucket list. Got to do it for sure. Let's talk a little bit about Ernie. You spoke about him briefly, but tell us a little bit about Ernie and his path.
Yeah, Ernie is really the central protagonist, if you will, of the book. The book more or less centers around him. He is the gold smuggler. He is the ivory smuggler. He is a guy who is outside the law. He does what he wants to do, and he does what he wants to do to make the living he wants to make in the Alaskan wilderness. And he runs around with his sidekick. He was trying to get himself a Russian bride, and he ended up with a Russian bodyguard because she didn't bother to get on the plane. And so he ends up with this Russian bodyguard named Tomas. And Tomas is very much a violent, Far Eastern Russian who knows nothing but Russian mafia kind of practices. And he works with Ernie. They're not mafia at all, but they're two very violent people who deal with the violence of the wilderness in a violent way. So they're always carrying firearms. They're always quick on the draw. And Ernie in particular, he's running around with this 15 round 45 automatic that he carries that he's quick to drop under the nose of people here and there. He doesn't do any shooting, and this is what kind of the amazing thing about the book. Um, Ernie is actually he does quite well without shooting too many people. He does shoot a bear though, and Tomas and he are working together, and they come upon that gold, and everything hinges around that gold and the tusks. And so there is a point. There's one very poignant scene where Ernie is at sea in the Bering Sea, and they've been out there for days already, and they've been in really steep seas, and he isn't getting seasick, but everybody else is. And he's looking at the skipper and he's going, I thought you said this was going to take 8 hours. And the skipper said, yeah, we ran into tough seas. And so we've been out here for days. And they're trying to meet a Russian trawler to trade the tusks for weapons, right? This is what's going on. But that whole depiction of the sea, the idea of how dangerous the sea is, particularly in Alaska, you've got 30 seconds if you fall overboard.
Right.
And so it's an extremely dangerous environment, and you're out there and there's no rescue. You're out in a little boat and there's no helicopter that can come and get you. There's nobody to come and get you. You're there, you're on your own, you're against this frozen water. And I think the depiction of that was the very first chapter I wrote in the book. The depiction of that really captures the essence of that kind of quiet terror that can be found when you're out in the middle of the Bering Sea.
Absolutely. It's the edge of survival in many ways between the weather and the sea and the other natural forces that come into play unexpectedly at times, such as earthquakes and windstorms that are 150 miles per hour. Absolutely amazing. The name of the book is Tusk, an Alaskan Adventure in Gold, Ivory, and Folklore. It is a gripping novel that weaves a tale of family tragedy, treasure hunting, and survival in the untamed wilderness of Alaska. If you love stories of adventure, mystery, and raw human resilience that is based in fact and novelized, this is a book you won't want to miss. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me here today on Spotlight.
Thank you, Logan. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I appreciate your time, your insight, and all of your fascinating stories, especially the ones contained within the pages of this book. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time, this time until next time on Spotlight.